Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Last time we talked all about the different methods of sampling in surveys. Today we're going to be talking about sampling bias in surveys. So, sampling bias is any factor that favors certain outcomes or responses, which systematically is going to skew the results. So of course there's, lots of ways of sampling that are not as good that are clearly going to result in bias sampling, like a convenient sample where you only choose your friends to be part of the sample rather than actually trying to do a proper sample and get a proper representation of everyone in the population or things like that. There's also other types as well that I want to talk about, that some of them having to do with the sampling method, but also some of them having to do with the actual survey, the actual questions, that kind of thing. Okay, so first I want to talk about non response bias. Now, non response bias occurs when a particular group is underrepresented because they chose not to participate. So, one example of this is, let's say that I decide to try and sample everybody at, everyone who answers a survey voluntarily at the University of Toronto, and I want their opinion on this new building and whether or not they think this new building was a good idea or a bad idea. Well, people who think it was a really, really good idea or a really, really bad idea are more likely to respond to that, right? Whereas if I don't really care either way about this new building and I think it's silly that people care so much one way or the other, I'm not as likely to participate than somebody who really, really loved that building and is so happy it's there, or somebody who thought the building was a total waste of money, they shouldn't have done it, and isn't happy with the school because of it, right? It also could happen because maybe a survey is too long. Some people just aren't going to end up wanting to respond. It takes too much time. Some people just don't want to take surveys because they don't want their opinion on the record. Other people are just too busy to bother with the survey. Those can also be reasons. It also could have to do with the method at which we're trying to reach people that we sample. So, for example, those who don't check their email as often, if it's an email survey, right, then people who don't check their email as often are less likely to end up participating in the survey. Let's say it's a phone survey where people are, get phone calls, then, some people who don't answer their phones or who don't have a phone aren't going to be represented as much. And then there's also certain demographics of people who are more likely to answer their phone, right? There's certain people who are more likely to be at home at a certain time for when the phone is there, that sort of thing as well is a factor as well. Also, internet access, if it's a survey through an email, right? If it's an email survey or something like that, then people who actually have the internet are able to access that, things like that, are more likely to answer than those who don't have an internet connection at home, that kind of thing. So basically, non response bias occurs when people either choose not to participate or aren't able to participate or that sort of thing, even though they are part of the population. At the end of the day, even the census does try to avoid non-response bias as much as possible, because I think the government actually makes you pay a fee or something if you don't answer the census, and most people would rather just answer the darn census than pay that fee, especially because it only comes around, I think it's once in every 4 years. And I'm pretty sure it's once in every 4 years. It's either once in every 4 or once in every 5, something like that. It's not every year that they do this census. So most people would rather just answer the darn thing rather than decide, oh, I don't want to, it's too long, I'd rather pay the fine, right? So that's something that happens there. Awesome. The second one is measurement bias. Okay, so measurement bias occurs when the data collection is either under or overestimated based on characteristics of the population. So, for example, let's say a survey is taken in a specific geographic area when it's meant to, represent population of people who are also outside of that geographic area, right? So, if I want to do a survey about all people in Ontario and how they feel about the winter, for example, but I only survey people in some of the warmest parts of Ontario, I'm going to get biased results. If I only sample Toronto, for instance, that's not necessarily representing people who live further up north or people who live in even slightly different places in southern Ontario, right? So that doesn't necessarily represent every Ontarian, right? Let's say the questions, um, Let's say the surveyor might also decide to only question a specific group when that specific group doesn't always accurately represent the entire population. That could be a problem. Or the surveyor only questions specific people they know. That can occur then as well. Or let's say the survey is conducted using a method that not everybody is, going to be equally represented in. So, for example, let's say the survey is on TikTok. Well, we're going to get some measurement bias about what ages the people in the overall population are, because mostly younger people are on TikTok. I don't know a lot of parents or people who are a bit older who have TikTok necessarily, right? So that's something else as well. So basically, whenever we have a data collection that's either going to under or overestimate a certain characteristic of the population, right? That's when we have our measurement bias occurring. The next one is response bias, and this is when participants, it says here, when a participants in the survey deliberately give false or misleading answers. I'm going to change this a little bit. It's when participants in a survey give false or misleading answers, but it's not necessarily deliberately. Sometimes it can be because a question on a survey was unclear. So I will say response bias is not always deliberate, right? Sometimes someone's an English language learner and is confused by a question. Sometimes somebody misinterprets a question. Things like that can occur. But however, it is also true that sometimes people will purposely give false answers. They might be embarrassed, or they might want to manipulate the data, or want to be sneaky, or there might be certain incentives to answer in a particular way. So, for example, let's say that somebody has committed tax fraud and they're asked about what their income was on the census. Well, they're most likely going to lie and say that their income was whatever they said it was on their taxes, because they do not want to get caught, right? If they're willing to lie on their taxes, they're willing to lie on the census, because if there's a discrepancy there, they might be worried that could cause a problem, right? Also, sometimes if like there's a now not everyone will think this way, but sometimes if there's like a certain prize for participating, like everyone gets a $25 gift card for participating in something, or especially if it's like a draw of a few people get a $25 gift card or a $100 gift card or something, they might think, oh well, I've got to answer in a particular way if I want to get that prize, even if it really is random who gets that. Some people might think, oh, I've got to answer the way that the business wants me to answer, and they want me to say positive things about them, hopefully, right? So that can also unfortunately sometimes skew those results. Now, in terms of you know writing a good survey where we're less likely to get response bias, we'll talk about that. Of course, we can't always prevent what people do. We can't control what other people do. However, there are ways to make our surveys more straightforward, less misleading, and just make sure overall that our surveys are clear, basically. So we'll talk about that in the future. Okay, so let's go back, and I want to talk about how we can not necessarily avoid these biases, but how can we limit these biases as much as possible. So let's start with non-response bias again, which again, that's when a particular group is underrepresented because they chose not to participate. So how can we avoid, well, not avoid, but how can we try and make this happen a bit less? Well, we can make sure that the survey is quick and concise, that the survey is not too crazy long. Also, some people might not want their opinion on the record. So, if we promise to keep people's identities a secret, we promise not to disclose the identities of the people in the survey, that could help. If people are too busy to do the survey, having it be a shorter survey might make people change their minds, so they might be able to do that. Also, if there's an incentive to do a survey, this can cause more people to want to participate. Now, giving an incentive is kind of a double-edged sword, though, because that could result in more response bias in certain cases. They might think, oh, I've got to answer in a certain way because they're giving me a prize, or I'm going to be put in a draw for this, or that sort of thing, and maybe they're less likely to pick me if I don't do what they want, kind of thing. So that's also a possibility there as well. And also just making sure that the survey is the most accessible possible for the most number of people in the population possible. Because if there's people who, for whatever reason, don't have the means or the option of answering the survey, then how are they going to answer the survey? So making sure the survey is easy to access, easy to do, doesn't take too long, will cause more people to be able to respond to the survey. So that's the first one. Now, how about measurement bias? So, this occurs when data collection is either consistently under or overestimating in the population. Okay, so let's go back to this. So, measurement bias is usually because we chose, like, let's be honest, we chose a bad method of sampling. We chose to do a convenient sample rather than actually specifically taking the time to make sure that the members of the population we're choosing to be in the sample are representative of the entire population. So basically, to avoid this one, long story short, is to make sure that we are choosing a good sampling method. So basically, not a convenient sample and not a voluntary sample. These are not good sampling methods, and they are likely to result in this. And the last one is response bias, where people give false or misleading answers either deliberately or not deliberately. So I think one way we can't really stop people from lying to us, right? Some people are just going to not want to tell the truth and want to manipulate the data or things like that. However, what we can do to try and prevent this as much as possible is make sure that it's clear that the answers are private and that we, have kind of an agreement with people that we are not going to share their answers with anybody else, right? Because they might feel embarrassment. They might, worry that if other people knew their answers, they would be rejected, especially if it's about, a very difficult, challenging kind of topic, right? Or a controversial topic, something like that. For example, if it's a survey about sexual assault and one of the questions is whether or not someone's been assaulted and they have, but they're not ready to share that with others yet, then they might not want to answer yes on a survey and, in fear that if they answer yes on a survey, will other people find out about it, right? And so making sure that it's clear that the answers that you give on the survey stay with us and that we promise not to share those with anybody. That can go a long way sometimes. Also, one other big thing with response bias is making sure that our questions are good questions that are easy to understand. So I always like to say, make sure that Amelia Bedelia would not misinterpret your survey. And for those of you who don't know who Amelia Bedelia is, she is a book character from like a kids book series. Some of you might have read her books growing up, and they were very silly. But basically, she would often misinterpret the things that Mrs. Rogers and Mr. Rogers, who were like the homeowners, would tell her to do because she was their housekeeper. So, for example, I think one example is they said to put the lights out, which they meant turn off the lights, but so they said put the lights out. She put the lights outside. She unscrewed the light bulbs. She put them outside. Or when they said ice the fish, she actually put icing on the fish, right, rather than putting like ice cubes on the fish, which is probably what Mr. and Mrs. Rogers meant. And there's lots more silly examples. But basically make sure that there is no possible way to misinterpret the question. Okay. So one example of a not very good question that could result in response bias is the question, "Do you have a car?" Right? Because what if the person has access to a car, but the car is in their mother's name or the car is in their spouse's name or something like that? They might say no to that. Also, what if the person has a motorcycle? Well, that's still a motor vehicle, but that's not a car, so no. Or what if they have like one of those like pickup trucks? Well, is that a car? Someone might say no. And so clarifying what you mean by "do you have a car?" and making sure that the question is better and actually gets across the point you want to get across is important. So for example, "Do you have reliable access to a vehicle?" could be a better question, if we're finding out about transportation in general and whether people have the access to it that they need, right? So that's an example there. Let's say that we're trying to figure out how many people actually have like cars versus taking public transit versus SUVs, things like that, then we should make that clear, right? Maybe there, instead of just yes or no to "do you have a car," could be having the different options of the different types of vehicles people could have and which one are ones they do or don't have, and also making sure it's clear about ownership, right? What if somebody leases a vehicle? Do they have a vehicle? Well, yes and no. They have a vehicle that they have access to, yes, but it's not their vehicle. They are borrowing the vehicle from someone else, and that person, and they're in exchange, they're paying money for someone else to let them use their vehicle. right? And so making it clear of, does leasing a car count for this question? Yes or no? What if you share a car with somebody? Does that count as yes, you have a car or not, right? So there's so many different ways that that question, do you have a car, yes or no, could be interpreted. And so making sure that you make it very clear as to what you actually mean by do you have a car is key. Also making sure that questions that should really just have one answer only have one answer. So let's say you want to know someone's age bracket and you say, okay, how old are you? And the answers are 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. Well, what would a 10-year-old put? Would they put 0 to 10, or would they say 10 to 20? Right, who knows? So rather than doing it that way, we should say, well, how about 0 to 10, and then 11 to 20, and then 21 to 30, and so on. So that way there's only really one possible correct answer for each person, and then maybe we end with, 71 plus or something, or 81 plus, or it doesn't matter. Making sure that there is a good, solid answer for every single person, that everyone answering the survey will be able to answer it accurately, because our questions don't really have multiple ways to interpret them. Amelia Bedelia could answer the survey accurately, so that's important. But also, we're not having questions that are a bit confusing, or where we're having questions where there's multiple correct answers people could have on questions where it should just be one answer. Of course, there are some questions where there's going to be multiple answers for some people. If you're asking about someone's ethnic background, well, how many people really just come from one country, right? People usually have quite a few different countries that make up their ethnic background, right? And so in that case, it would be okay if people check multiple answers. But there are some times, like how old are you, where we don't really want people checking multiple boxes or being confused as to what to do. And so some people who are both supposed to check the same category end up checking different ones, that sort of stuff. So just making sure that our survey is a good survey that's easy to interpret, and that our questions and answers are clear and don't cause any unnecessary confusion. All right, well, that is it for bias in surveys. I hope you learned a lot from this, and we will see you next time to talk about measures of central tendency. Good work, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.